The United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent is a global call to action to address issues impacting people of African descent in the areas of recognition, justice, and development. In 2014, the United Nations General Assembly declared January 2015 to December 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. The decade recognizes that people of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected, but the CARICOM Reparations Commission has called for a second international decade for people of African descent.
As we approach the end, it is becoming very apparent that the first decade was established at a time when not much was known about why we needed the decade. And it has therefore taken a decade for us to be able to sufficiently understand and get governments and people the world over to understand why it is important to have a second decade for people of African descent.
Mr. Bousquet provided the history which inspired the move to observe the decade. He outlined the challenges faced in achieving CARICOM's reparation goal during the initial decade.
In 1920, when Marcus Garvey issued that first call for August 31st to be the International Day for People of African Descent. And certainly that day was eventually observed within the decade. The main problem why the decade has not achieved anything is because sufficient funds were not put into the decision of establishing the decade.
He provided insight as to why a second decade is being requested by the CARICOM Commission in 2025. Mr. Bousquet says it is incumbent that such decisions are made ahead of time with no delay in execution.
The call now is for a second decade to do all of the things that we recognize need to be done during the first decade, but that second decade will, we hope, be one that will include funding for that decade from the United Nations with contributions by all member nations and not only those that represent people of African descent. And that is also important because we sometimes take decisions in the Caribbean that are not ahead of time.
He says the call for a second international decade for people of African descent underscores the ongoing need for global recognition and action to address the historical and systemic injustices faced by people of African descent.
We are still talking about getting a meeting with the European Union to be able to get them to agree that reparations are due. And during that 10 years, we've heard royal statements of sorrow that fall short of apologies. We've had apologies from kings. We've had statements of regret, but none of which have amounted to any government saying we are going to dip into the treasury to pay that reparations that is owed.
The appeal to the United Nations comes as CARICOM celebrates Africa CARICOM Day, a day dedicated to honoring the shared history and the strong bonds of culture and ancestry between Africa and the Caribbean community. For the DBS News World, Manasseh Stanislas reporting.